Hello YouTube, this is Morgan Airspeed Prime here with my next Star Wars The Clone Wars episode review. This one's going to be for Season 7, Episode 8, Together Again. And this was the final episode of this Ahsoka walkabout arc, the Trace and Rafa arc, whatever way you want to call it. And there was a lot of hype going into this episode because of the Mandalorian setup from the previous one. And I think, unfortunately, this episode was a bit of a miss. I was very disappointed with this episode. And I think a lot of people, now that we're at the end of this arc, have settled on the idea that this really was not what we needed. Now, I think it is one of these situations where if this was just an arc in the middle of the full show as they had planned it, we'd be fine. But instead, this arc has to be the one and only Ahsoka on her own away from the Jedi Order arc to span the Season 5 finale into the Siege of Mandalore. This one has to do it all, and it comes nowhere near doing it in the way that they needed to do it. And so I think this episode really does fall short on pretty much every aspect of plot and character. And I'm going to get into that now. One, the Mandalorian stuff, I think they were way too cautious about it, and they did way too many teases of it before finally just being like, okay, it's basically just a final scene thing. They ask Ahsoka for her help on the Siege of Mandalore. A little bit of context of her learning about Maul being on Mandalore, obviously just prior to this. But fundamentally, it's just a final scene setup, basically. And given how little they did with the Trace and Rafa stuff, which I'll get into next, I really think they should have reordered this episode to have, to devote almost the final third or so, final half of this episode to the Mandalorian stuff. I think that was the way you really needed to go with it, because unfortunately, 4 episodes of Trace and Rafa, given that you did nothing with them, was not good enough. And it's this weird disappointment of these are characters who by the end didn't matter. The second the Mandalorians entered that scene, you saw the gulf in class between the characters. Bo-Katan is this character you really care about, is impactful, and Trace and Rafa were just these random characters that we had for this arc. And the second that they were in the same scenes together, you realized these two do not matter at all. And the show treated them that way because there was no resolution to their arc. They get out of it alive. They go back to where they live, on Coruscant. But they don't in any way say anything about what's happened, what's changed by meeting Ahsoka, if they're going down a different path or anything like that. You can roughly take away from this arc that, maybe Rafa is not going to go down the path of doing any more of these criminal deals after this. And it's okay, yeah, I kind of would assume that would be the path. But with Trace, I by the end of this, I'm kind of what even arc was there? I thought there was a slight hint of something of she really wants to be a pilot. She has this sort of, destiny potential that should lead her off planet to do something better because she seems like she could do something more. But in the end, it's just, okay, the sisters are seemingly just going back to things the way they were. Maybe slightly changed because of Ahsoka's impact on them, but what is that change? I don't really know. And so, yeah, this episode, I think the main thing I took from it was just that, why was this 4 episodes? Why on earth did they think that this was 4 episodes? And this really gets into, I think, that they should have edited the arcs given that it is this sort of fractured final season. What they did instead was take these arcs, which were clearly meant to be part of multiple more seasons, 7, 8, and 9. So there's meant to be 6, 7 more arcs, which is fine spreading it all out and that you have the development for all the different aspects and stuff like that. And so it works a little bit better because you're spread out over the course of 3 seasons. But when you only have 1 season, 3 arcs, and you use 2 of the more random arcs from other seasons, to make up the body of your final season here, that's where it becomes such a problem. And it really feels like they chose the arcs on the basis of how complete they were, rather than which episodes together would make for the most impactful final season. And the fact that it is the final season is what informs, I think, most of the criticism of this arc, because it doesn't touch on any of the things I think people care about going into the finale. In that, like, the Bad Batch arc was fine, but then, like, they have this weird, like, echo setup at the end for him going off with the Bad Batch, and it's like, are we even going to see the Bad Batch again? So what are you even doing? This arc is like, what was the point of the Martez sisters for 4 episodes when that's all you did with them at the end? Did Ahsoka learn anything from the sisters? Not really. Was her perspectives on the Jedi Order challenged by her meeting people who had issues with them? Very, 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 very minorly. But for the most part, no, because it doesn't really link into what Ahsoka's actual issue and why she's not back with the Jedi Order, what it is. And I'll get to that in a second when I talk about Ahsoka. But it's just that, like, this arc ultimately had one thing to accomplish, and that was that by the end of it, you get Ahsoka back into the fight. And it seemed like all they had to go on was that the arc that they were going for is that Ahsoka fundamentally as a character wants to help people. And so because of that, she of course is going to assist in the Siege of Mandalore, even if that means having to go back to the Jedi Order. And I think the biggest, I suppose, indictment against this arc was that line of, like, Ahsoka, like I'm worried, what was it, like, I'm worried or I'm, like, afraid of what this could mean, and they're like, meaning joining up with the Jedi Order again, and she's like, yeah. And it's kind of like why did you word it in that way? In that, like, I know Ahsoka is upset at the Jedi Order, but, like, you care about helping people, and you can do that best as part of the Order. Like, why is it all worry and fear when so many of the people she, like, cares about in her life are part of the Jedi Order? I get she was very, very hurt by what happened, but at this point, given that they haven't really explained what's keeping her away, they haven't had her go through in her head, why she is staying away, what she's trying to figure out, because that's why she left. She said she has to figure stuff out on her own. What has she figured out? And I don't think she's figured out anything, because they didn't deal with it here at all. And their attempts to mention stuff with the Jedi just fell completely flat, in my opinion. Like, the story about what happened to Trace and Rafa's parents, like, is Ahsoka going to double down on, yeah, I'm staying away from the Jedi Order because of that incident where, like, they tried to, capture a criminal and an accident happened? Like, yeah, that's the problem with the Jedi Order. Like, is Ahsoka's Jedi Order problem with the Jedi Order that they are not, like, emotional particularly, that they keep themselves detached? I don't think that's the case either, because those were the two takeaways from the sisters, what the sisters' issue was. Because Ahsoka defended in, like, one of the previous episodes the Jedi on the basis of, like, being involved in the war, and I think because she's been involved in the Clone Wars, she gets why they're fighting there. So you go back to Ahsoka's issue with the Jedi Order is a very personal one. It's directly about what happened in season 5, in that final arc. That's it, basically. Everything else, she's ready to go. She cares about the Jedi Order, and we know that because of the few scenes where they reference, like, Anakin and the Jedi Order. She talks about it as, like, yeah, like, I learned all my skills here. These people of, like, like, I kind of consider Anakin like an older brother, type thing. So it is purely that kind of trust that was broken because of what happened. And she can't really resolve that unless she talks to the people that she was, upset at. So this arc, in a way, can't happen until we finally get there. So why was this arc almost, like, set up in such a way? I really, really don't get what they were going for. I hope they can manage to do something with this in the final arc, with her scenes with Anakin and Obi-Wan, in that, you know, we ultimately know, like, she never, I think, properly goes back to being a Jedi, because I think even in Rebels, like, the way she's introduced, she's not a Jedi. It is more of just like she is a sort of I suppose neutral force user isn't probably the best way to say it. She's still like a light side user. It's just she's not directly part of the Jedi Order, but still is roughly going about the ideas. So, you know, it's just the confusion about that sort of thing of like, okay, like what way are they actually going to do it? Because otherwise, you're basically saying there is no arc for Ahsoka. Like, her thinking about things in between season 5 and where we are now in season 7 is just time away. And I'm just worried that they've really thrown away a huge potential for character development for Ahsoka with this, because this arc just, in my mind, really did absolutely nothing over the course of its run. Because, like I said, the Martez sisters ultimately by the end felt like just complete throwaway characters because of the way they did their resolution. Like, there's no sense of like the future is brighter for these two because they met Ahsoka and she helped change their lives. No, it's just they're back. They know she's a Jedi. They sort of now have a different perspective on Jedi because they met one. Ahsoka's leaving. They're there. That's it. Like, nothing really to say because they're just, that was it. 4 episodes of kind of setup for stuff for them for nothing. You didn't go far enough into the Mandalorian stuff in this episode to really, you know, overly set up the next arc. And then Ahsoka really didn't have much of a character development arc over the course of this season, because it was just her deciding to help out the sisters after she sort of literally fell into their lives. And that's the problem here, that this was about the sisters and it was just Ahsoka assisting in their lives. And then they didn't actually have anything for Ahsoka to sort of really do or learn from this experience. So it was purely just a story with Ahsoka rather than the story with Ahsoka that we really wanted. I have full confidence that the final arc will be very, very strong, because it seems like that is very much what they've been marketing this season on the basis of, for the most part, is that final arc. And I think it will be really, really good, but I can understand why people's expectations are maybe a little bit more in line going into this than they were previously, just because Bad Batch was not the way to start this season, and then this arc, which had some build-up and hype, I think really failed to deliver, and that's the reaction that I've seen from the most part online, is that this arc, just, I'm so glad that this is over. Like, just people echoing that statement. It's just like, finally can we get into the good stuff, because that arc had potential but they did nothing with it. And it was incredible to see the shift from the reaction to the first episode of this arc, where a lot of people were kind of like, okay, like, it wasn't particularly plot important, but like, it was great to have Ahsoka back and I'm sure it'll pick up as it goes on. And then just as the episodes went by, everyone realizing that, okay, they're not really doing anything, it'll get better. They're not doing anything, it will get better. Oh, the Mandalorians are here. Next episode it'll get better. Oh. And it's just like, wow, 2/3 of the season gone, and we really haven't had that stand out super strong episode of the Clone Wars season 7 yet, in my mind. Like, if you just like sort of the clone action battles for the sake of battles, you know, some of the stuff in the Bad Batch arc was fairly good, but for the most part, you know, once again, I don't think anything particularly insightful. As for other scenes, like, obviously we got to see Maul on the hologram, talking to the leader of the Pikes. He mentioned Crimson Dawn, but again, this is where some of the setup and plot stuff comes into play. Just like, I think there'll be a lot of people wondering, like, how is Maul back? Like, last we saw him, he was captured by Sidious and was presumed like he was going to be tortured or whatever. If you haven't read the Son of Dathomir comic, you won't have a clue why he's back, how he's back, the details that have happened between then and now. And I hope they have some sort of a brief rundown of like some events that happened that have led Maul to come back, because I do think they need to fill people in on this, because that's a relatively old comic at this point. Like, I don't know if you can just assume that everyone has read it, Because if you are assuming that, you are placing a ton of importance on that comic that they just don't do anywhere else. So that's going to be one of those unfortunate ones. And that I really feel that at this point, the reaction to the end of this season is going to be that, like, the finale was great, but why on earth weren't the other arcs like Dark Disciple and Son of Dathomir? Like, I think that is going to be a lot of reaction to the other non-finale episodes of this season. It's just, why weren't they something else, something more important that felt like the finale? Why weren't they your big arcs? Instead, you just gave us 2 arcs. But yeah, the mall scene was nice because, you know, it was kind of like, oh, Ahsoka sees that there's a threat still out there. She hears about it on Mandalore. That sort of informs her decision to go off with them at the end. That's at least, you know, something to set up this Ahsoka Maul rivalry that we're going to have for this final arc. But again, it's so weird that we're going into this final arc that is ultimately going to lead up to a showdown between Maul and Ahsoka, when both of them have had these very fractured stories at this point. Ahsoka's return to the Jedi Order hasn't been done very well so far. Maul's return into the story hasn't been done very well because the show hasn't said anything about it. How will they bridge those last little gaps to get us to that fight? Because I don't think it's enough to just be like, oh, you roughly know how they get there. It needs to all fit together. So, you know, I hope they just have something, like anything, to make that work in the final arc. Like, there was kind of an interesting scene of, like, just over the hologram, like, Maul sort of sensing her and her staying out of his sight. And the thing here is that this is going to be a major test for Ahsoka. If Ahsoka can go and fight Maul one-on-one on an even playing field, that will be a huge insight into, like, where she is as a character. But they need to have the character development there before they get to sort of the, like, power level development type stuff. I think that's roughly where I want to wrap this one up. And I'll end with just saying that, like, look, I didn't hate this arc. I don't hate the Bad Batch arc. I don't hate this arc. These are all, I think, perfectly fine Clone Wars episodes. Perfectly fine Clone Wars arcs. And if you just view them just completely in a vacuum, they're both fine. They're not top tier Clone Wars arcs. They're not bottom tier Clone Wars arcs. They're just somewhere in the middle. They're just arcs. They're not the most memorable. They're not the most, like, forgettable. But it's the final season, and everything in this season is informed on the basis of that. It is the final season. There is a hype to that because of the setup that we've had for years, that Clone Wars is back for one final season. So, yeah, you've missed on the first 2 arcs, and I think there's no real debate against that. Like, yes, they're enjoyable episodes, but should we be really settling for just solid for this final season when the expectations are so high? And I think that's probably about where I want to end on, of just, like, any other season, that's fine. If they announced, like, a few weeks back that, like, oh yeah, the reception to Clone Wars Season 7 has been good, we are confirming we will do more arcs, I think everyone would calm down a little bit, and there'll be a lot more like, okay, fine, we can breathe here. It's not just this, like, countdown to no more Clone Wars episodes. As it is, I think everyone is sort of counting the minutes, the importance, and the timeline of things matters a bit too much. But yeah, that's my thoughts on this episode of Clone Wars. In the comments, let me know what your thoughts were, but that's been the video. Thanks for watching, and bye.